probably thought when they came home, all the prophecies would be fulfilled at once. If we've read the history of what the kingdom had been like, we think there is a future homecoming. There is a future return from exile. If the return from exile is a kind of a resurrection from the dead, there is a future resurrection needed to really do a work in the people's hearts. All of that is in our minds as we come to the New Testament.
Hello, welcome to the Bible OverBrew. My name is Rachel Redeemed, and we have with us Matt Sells as we jump in to Ezra and Nehemiah. Hopefully you have found thebibleoverbrew.com, which has our key chapters for today and some notes to help you, because I'm about to throw a lot of numbers at you. But we will be overbrewing, but with a little emphasis on Ezra 1-3 and Nehemiah 1-3 and 12 and 13. I'm really excited about this, partly because I've kind of not really understood what's gone on in these books before, and I think having done the order that we've done, things have started to make a bit more sense. So I understand it was one scroll originally, but Matt, brew check?
Check.
Fabulous.
Bible check. Yep.
All
How about
good.
yourself?
What have I got? Oh, hopefully I don't fall asleep in this episode, because I've gone with one of those sleepy teas. It's all, lime flowers and oat flowers and a bit of lavender. It's great, and I really like it, but I don't use it to
one
sleep.
Christmas, my mum gave me loads of things. It was like tea for when you're stressed, like shower gel for when you're stressed, everything for when you're stressed. And I was like, are you trying to tell me something? So,
oh dear.
Okay.
Well, I'm not saying the Bible is going to put me to sleep. That's what I'm not saying.
Good.
May we have a little of the story so far?
Yes. Ezra and Nehemiah, we're going to be thinking about the return from exile. And that's only going to make sense if we know what the exile is. So a bit of a sort of exile overbrew. Well, starting at the beginning, Genesis 1 and 2, God created this brilliant world, humanity placed in a garden, a place of paradise. What made it paradise is relationship with God. But we all know sin led to them being cast out to the east, a sort of exile. And so right from the start, we have humanity in the presence of God, in this paradise, this kind of temple place, described in very temple-like language, but cast away from God due to their sin. By the end of Genesis, they wind up in Egypt, and then they're brought up from Egypt to the Promised Land. They're brought into this new sort of paradise garden type place, and they build the temple. In a sense, what makes it the Promised Land is not just the milk and honey, though there is that, but the temple, God comes to dwell with them there. And then they get a king and various other things. But brought out of slavery to be, in a sense, back in the presence of God. There's still some qualifications to that. The temple still has the curtain with those cherubim, that kind of keep out sign. But still, God is making his dwelling place in the midst of the people. And so the land where they end up, Joshua, they come into the land, and then Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, all this takes place in the land, the promised land, land of Canaan. That is something of a new Eden. But just as Adam sinned in Eden, so the people sin in the land. Actually, way back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the Lord sort of really predicted this. He said, I'll bring you into the land, but if when you're in the land, you sin and disobey me, you break my covenant and rebel against me, I will cast you out. I will scatter you among the nations. Amazingly, even in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it says, but then once I've done that, if you then return to me, I will bring you home again. So if we've read carefully, we should know that the exile, that when the people were in the land and they did sin and that God is incredibly patient, and we've got hundreds of years of patience. A few good kings, lots of bad kings, lots of mess in the books of 1, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, lots of sin, lots of distrust of God. Eventually, people cast out into exile to the east, but with that kind of hope that they might be brought back. It was there in Leviticus, it was there in Deuteronomy. The kingdom splits after Solomon. The northern kingdom go off into Assyria, and we sort of don't hear from them again, but the southern kingdom is where we focus, because that's where Jerusalem is. They head off into Babylon. The Babylonians come, they take them captive, they resettle them there. And that's sort of what people did in that day. As you conquered territories, often you bring people, and so Daniel and others get taken off into exile. If you're with us for the last episode, in Daniel we saw that Babylon, which is where the people are in exile, that got conquered by Persia, and so that in a sense the people are now in exile in Persia. So hence we've got these Persian kings, and that's where we get to at the start of Ezra, the first year of King Cyrus, king of Persia. We might be thinking, Persia, what's that got to do with anything? But really, the people are in Babylon, but it's now become part of the Persian Empire. So that's why we've got these Persian kids. But essentially, the people are in exile at the start of Ezra. But one of the things I've loved about reading in this Hebrew Bible order, where we don't do Ezra and Nehemiah straight after the history in Kings, but all the prophets have come first, is we see that the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12, the minor prophets, they promised a return from exile. They prophesied the exile, the judgment to come. They promised a return, but along with that, they promised so many other things. And it's really good. We've seen some of those things. The mountain of the Lord being established. They promised God making a new covenant with his people. They promised the Lord himself coming to dwell with his people. They promised a new king in David's line who would shepherd the people with justice. They promised a new heart for the people, God washing them clean and circumcising their heart and enabling them to obey him. They promised prosperity and peace. Amos 9:13, the mountains will drip with sweet wine. They promised the lame leaping for joy, the eyes of the blind being opened in Isaiah 35. So much is promised when the return from exile is going to happen. And reading in this order, I think we read Ezra and Nehemiah with these promises in mind as well. You see, the exile, it wasn't just about geography being taken away from the land. It was to do with relationship with God, being taken away from the land, therefore being taken away from God and his blessings. And so the return from exile that we'll see in Ezra and Nehemiah was always going to have to be about more than geography. It's not just getting the people in the right place. It's not just about, getting the train in Persia and scooting. It wouldn't be the train, but, it's not just about getting to the right destination. There's a whole lot of theology, a restored relationship with God and all that comes with that. And I think that'll help to understand the slightly anticlimactic nature of Ezra and Nehemiah, even though they end up in the right place, even though a new temple is built. For those who knew the prophecies, for those who knew how things had been and how things should be, this probably isn't quite what we were hoping for. So that's what we'll see. But it begins with Cyrus, king of Persia, making a decree, making a declaration that the exiles can come home.
That's so helpful. It makes so much sense of when I've engaged with this book or books to see that it's like, oh, this is the return of the exile. Right, tick. But actually oh, no, hang on. There's a lot more that's not quite kind of come to fruition. That makes a lot more sense. Help us. What should we be looking for in these early chapters?
Chapter 1, we sort of get the events of what happens. If people have maybe been to the British Museum, you can go and see the Cyrus cylinder. I don't know if Cyrus himself wrote it, but essentially his account of repopulating people. And, for him, I think it was just his foreign policy. But actually you come to Ezra 1 and you see what lay behind that. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. And then actually the Lord stirs up the spirit of the people to go. We can see the Lord is behind this. Whatever Cyrus thought he was doing, he probably didn't think I'm furthering the plans of the people of God. But actually the Lord directed this powerful king a real king in real history to send a real people home. It's just wonderful that we can, these events are documented elsewhere. And it's interesting just at the end of chapter 1, it speaks of the exiles being brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. And if we plot the geography, you think brought up from Babylonia. Well, no, it's Babylonia was off to the west, Persia, Babylon. We're sort of the Tigris-Euphrates area, but brought up. That's harking back to brought up out of Egypt. This is being intentionally described in a new Exodus way. And I think Egypt, you did come up from Egypt to get to the land of promise. But I think also the emphasis on coming up from Egypt was it's something of a resurrection. They sort of went down to Egypt to the grave and then they were resurrected. And so this is something of a rebirth, a resurrection for the nation.
Cool. But it doesn't completely go smoothly.
No.
Between Ezra and Nehemiah, there's quite a long time going on and there's different people involved. Can you help us get a sense of who is who at this point?
Yeah, so bizarrely, what we know as the book of Ezra, when it begins in the first year of King Cyrus, so it begins quite early in the history, I think 539 BC. I say that as if I would ever remember a date. So I'm saying that just to prove we looked this up, but I wouldn't remember that. But it's just at the beginning of Cyrus's reign, the people get sent back under this guy Zerubbabel, possibly also Sheshbazzar, but the kind of the governor of Judah. Interestingly, governor, not a king. So maybe that's already a hint. Okay, so there's no king at this stage. There's a governor, but this guy Zerubbabel, who we meet elsewhere. Ezra himself won't actually come along till nearly 100 years later,
Wow.
because the people got sent back to start rebuilding, but it was slow. And so the book of Ezra takes place over, I think, probably over 100 years.
So we do get to chapter 3 where things are happening. Maybe it's not all going to go to plan, but we get the foundations of the temple being laid. But we get people shouting for joy at those foundations going down, but also people weeping because they are sad that I think it's not what it once was. So we have joy and sorrow at that. Then there's people who don't want it to happen, of any of this rebuilding malarkey. So things then spiral in a different direction. But I find it a little bit confusing because there's someone called Zerubbabel and this book's called Ezra, and the timeline of how this all works out is slightly. I would love a little clarity on that if we could snatch that.
Yeah, the book's called Ezra, but he actually doesn't appear till probably almost 100 years after the book starts. So even though the book gets called Ezra, probably because he wrote it all down, it starts in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia with this, okay, exiles can go home. We've got this guy Zerubbabel, who is the governor. I think governor's interesting. He's not the king. There's no king after the exile. So we've got a governor, a leader, and he takes the exiles home, and they get rebuilding the temple and the foundations laid, and there's kind of joy but also sorrow because it's not what it once was or maybe what it should be. There's then people who oppose the rebuilding. We'll see a number of enemies, some who just like the status quo, as well as some people who don't like Israel, and so enemies of God's people. We then sort of jump around a bit, and various different bits of opposition get recorded, and the kind of chronology gets a little bit all over the place. What happens is rebuilding stops for a while. If those have been tracking along, the prophet Haggai, I think at this point, says, hey, folks, you're living in panelled houses, but the house of the Lord's in a ruin. So chapter 5, verse 1 mentions this Haggai and Zechariah prophesying and encouraging them to get rebuilding. And so there's now been a new king. We had Cyrus, now we've got the king Darius. And so they sort of need permission again from because this is still part of the Persian Empire, really. So they need permission to rebuild. They do at the end of chapter 6, and they celebrate Passover. And it is a bit of a high point. But then chapter 7, now after this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra comes on the scene. And this is over 100 years. There's like Cyrus, then Darius, then Xerxes, who, if we remember the book of Esther takes place in the reign of Xerxes, and then we've got Artaxerxes. Don't worry about all the chronology other than, let's just think about it. The people went home, build the temple, stopped for a while. Haggai had to get them going. They just about get it done. But over 100 years later, Ezra comes along and says, you still haven't really finished. And so if we compare this to the pattern that we've seen, out of slavery, brought into the presence of God, build the temple. That's the pattern of the Exodus. I think probably 100 years is too long for that to happen. And so Ezra is sent to kind of teach the people God's law and to encourage them to be about his business, not leave the temple sort of, I mean, it's been finished, but there's still various objects and things that get put in. So a lot of this is about priorities. Ezra teaches the law, beautifies the temple, and actually encourages the people to be faithful to God. And so you get these laws about sort of intermarriage and various things. He's saying, hey, look, it's not, I think the point Ezra's saying is, it's not okay just to be back in the land. I think for some of the people, they're thinking, okay, we were in Babylon, Persia. We're now back in the land. Tick.
Yes.
Haggai previously had said, no, you can't just live in comfort while the house of God is in ruins. Ezra is saying similar things. Actually, you need to be about the work of God, to beautify the house, and also to reform your lives. You've come home from exile, but sort of your hearts maybe are still far away. Your hearts need to come home as well. And Ezra sort of finishes fairly abruptly. But I think if we realize it's one scroll and then Nehemiah, it's really a continuation of that story, a continuation of this coming home from exile and looking for the fullness of all God's blessings.
Which means we're going to meet Nehemiah, our cupbearer to the king, who teaches about arrow prayers. We meet him in chapter 1, and he hears about what's going on and sits down and weeps, and he fasts, he prays. So he's the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, and I think that is pretty high ranking position to hopefully stop the king getting poisoned. And he looks sad in his presence, which I think was probably quite a big deal. But he is then kind of asked what's going on and kind of prays to the Lord. But you're like, well, there probably wasn't enough time for him to kind of run off, close the door, go away. So it feels like he just prays in that moment to be like, help! And
that's the arrow prayer, isn't it?
That's the arrow prayer. Quickly shooting it up in a distress and knowing that the Lord of Heaven hears. And then he ends up getting involved in the rebuilding himself. So where we were looking more with Ezra towards the temple, with Nehemiah, it's more about the walls. And we see him get involved, but again, opposition happens. What should we be keeping our eye out for in Nehemiah?
Like in Ezra, there's opposition to the rebuilding. I mean, there's a it's interesting to look at the obstacles to rebuilding. In chapter 3, you get an interesting one. I mean, some of Nehemiah, if I can say this, is boring. In that, it is just a list of who rebuilt what.
Yeah.
But remember, if you're one of the people and you sort of heard your family and what you rebuilt, in a sense, we don't want to get lost in some of the detail, but it's the whole people of God being about the work of God. And when you see that, then you get 1 verse 5, but the nobles wouldn't stoop to serve the Lord. Okay, apart from the nobles and the rich people at this stage, you think, we'll let other people carry the load. We're the nobles. We shouldn't work up a sweat. So you get just a little bit there. Then you get the sort of the enemies, the people who don't want God's people to flourish. We've seen all the way through it. It's Genesis 3:15. The offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman. Satan will oppose God, and he does that by opposing his people, by attacking his people. And we're waiting for a serpent crusher who will one day crush evil forever. But unsurprisingly, we see enemies. They're kind of sneaky in all kinds of ways. There's plots and lies and political shenanigans and maneuverings. And it's quite interesting just to trace Nehemiah trying to walk all through this. It's like, hey, why don't you meet us all on that really dark street on the way out of Jerusalem? You know, the one where if someone screamed, no one would hear them. Come, let's meet. Like, there's all there's all this going on. And it's a brilliant story. But I think just actually it's that picture of opposition to God's work. In chapter 5, another obstacle is the poor being oppressed. And interestingly, Nehemiah brings charges against the nobles and the officials again. He's saying, look, the poor are being exploited here. That's hindering what we're doing. And that's wrong. I find it really interesting that actually in the book of Acts, it's one of the first challenges the church faces. In Acts 6, the Greek-speaking widows are being neglected in the daily food offering. I think there's a bit of racism going on there, that those of a different language and culture are being neglected, but the poor and the weak are being neglected, and that needs to be sorted out. That can't stand while God's people are seeking to be under his rule and blessing. Just interesting that, again, the same sort of thing happens here. Nehemiah has to stop the oppression of the poor and just get all of God's people working together, not some lording it over others. But the wall is finished. The wall is finished at the end of chapter 6. And again, we get this kind of great moment of joy. And yeah, the Lord's been with Nehemiah. We get a number of times the Lord's hand was on Nehemiah. Nehemiah's been praying constantly. We see this is the work of the Lord to build the walls, because that was protection. So that enemies couldn't come. So God's people could be his people and be kept safe.
So the walls are up. And then if we lightly land in chapter 8, we get this. All the people came together as one in the square before the Watergate. They told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. So on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand. He read it aloud from daybreak till noon as he faced the square before the Watergate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. It feels like a bit of a shift from what we've had so far. Perhaps they seem pretty keen for the book of the law. Am I missing something, or are they actually getting it?
No, I think they are. Yeah, they seem to be. This is good. I think this is good. I mean, they stand there quite a long time, daybreak till noon.
Yeah.
That's a long. I mean, I've had some long Bible readings in church, but never that long.
Mm.
Um, that's yeah. I think at least the book of Deuteronomy would have been read, probably.
Mm.
The book of the law often could mean Deuteronomy, or maybe I mean they've got all morning. Maybe it was more than that. I hope they had a lot of tea. But this is good. And what's interesting is this isn't seen as burdensome. Is it Nehemiah or Ezra? So it's interesting. Ezra and Nehemiah are actually, they were mates. They were together at this stage. In chapter 10, eat the fat, drink sweet wine, send portions to anyone who's got nothing ready. This day is holy to our Lord. Do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Actually, to have God's law read out is not, oh no, a burdensome thing, but a wonderful gift. Back in Deuteronomy, the nations were going to go, wow, what an amazing nation Israel is, to have God so near to them, to have these wonderful laws.
Mm.
And it's interesting, I think we can see what Ezra and Nehemiah is doing here in chapter 8 is sort of building another wall. Nehemiah's built the wall, or organized the building of the wall, to protect from external enemies, keep out the foreign armies. But you don't need to read too much of the history of Israel to realize their problems were not only, or even not primarily, enemies out there. Their problems with their own hearts, and just constantly just turning like one of those supermarket trolleys with a broken wheel, just constantly veering off in the wrong direction. And so Ezra can sort of almost be seen as building another wall, the wall of Torah, of law. He's teaching people the law of God so that their hearts might be following him more faithfully, because actually their sin has been what's led to so many problems. And so at this stage, it's a wonderful thing. Chapter 9, the people confess their sins, and we get this long kind of prayer of how really it's like a Bible overview, but it's a Bible overview with focus on the people's sin. Just remind you, not so they can be sort of just beat themselves up and be down on themselves, but confessing sin and remembering God's faithfulness even when the people sinned. And so it's this wonderful moment of confession, sort of not because of our righteousness, Lord, is essentially the summary. And it's this great moment. And I guess we're thinking, okay, are we now here? Is this the golden age that's beginning? Back in the land, tick. Temple rebuilt. I mean, it took a while, but tick. Walls rebuilt so that people can be protected from external enemies, tick. Book of the law being faithfully taught. I mean, it should have been the king who was doing that as well as the priest. There's no king, but tick. So there's lots that's going well. End of chapter 10. We will not neglect the house of our God, they all say. The last verse in chapter 10. Chapter 12, the wall is dedicated, and it reminds me of sort of King David days. We've got thanksgiving and singing and cymbals and harps. We've got these two choirs that go in opposite directions around the wall. As a musician, I just love the idea of these sort of one choir goes that way, one choir. I mean, I don't know if they're singing the same thing and trying to stay in time until they got back together. Who knows? They offered sacrifices with great joy. God made them rejoice. The joy of Jerusalem could be heard from miles away. You can just imagine, what's that? It's Jerusalem. They're celebrating because of all God has done. And we think, this is it, is it? But then chapter 13, we see, well, there's nepotism going on. Eliashib the priest has made a special place in the house of the Lord for Tobiah, this guy that is related to him. And then by the middle of chapter 13, why is the house of God forsaken? Nehemiah can confront the officials and say, why is the house of God forsaken? Just a couple of chapters previously, they said, we will not forsake the house of the Lord. And so the book ends with sin, and just the cracks are starting to appear. Chasms are starting to appear. And so we've sort of got this seeming high point. Back in the land, tick. Temple rebuilt, tick. Walls rebuilt, tick. God's law being taught and kept faithfully. Not so much with all of that, as well as so many of the prophecies that we've seen. When the return from exile truly happened, the whole bunch of other things were going to come with it. And so I think with those things in mind, Nehemiah kind of peters out. It's a bit of a whimper rather than a grand finale.
Mm. I think at least I feel that I understand why I don't need to pretend that this is great. I can just be like, yeah, it doesn't end great because this isn't where it's supposed to land.
Mm.
And from having looked at the prophecies and having got a bit more out of them as to what I'm supposed to be finding as
Mm.
some of the key things, I think I'm now like, it's okay, it's not brilliant right now. There's more to come, folks. In fact, let me read some from Isaiah that we are still holding on for.
Mm.
So, Isaiah 2 2 and 3. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. 35, 4 and 6, still in Isaiah, has Be strong, do not fear, your God will come. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy.
Mm.
And 52, verse 8. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion.
Mm.
Ah, there's more to come, folks. There's more happening that we've not seen yet.
Those who knew the scriptures will be thinking, this isn't the return from exile. All that's to come. Isaiah 65, the new heavens and the new earth.
Mm.
Whatever happened with this return from exile, this is just a sort of a partial fulfillment, just still a shadow of the reality that's to come. Jeremiah 31, the new covenant, when God will write his laws on the people's hearts. Read the end of
Mm.
Nehemiah, that has not happened. Ezekiel promises this king coming in David's line. Ezekiel 34. Well, actually, verse 15, God says, I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep. I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord God. Shepherd is a kingly title. So God's somehow saying he is going to be their Davidic king. How's that going to work, we
Mm.
think? And then verse 23 of Ezekiel 34, I myself will set over them one shepherd, my servant David. He shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God. My servant David shall be prince among them. Get this hope of this king in David's line who seems to be identified with God himself will be in charge. Much as we love Zerubbabel, he ain't that.
Mm.
Zerubbabel, the governor, does a good job, I think, but I mean, he's not the king in David's line who is identified with God himself. Nor is the blessing and prosperity. I mean, think back to Solomon's kingdom. Think of the blessing and the prosperity and the Queen of Sheba coming. Like in that Isaiah 2 passages, the nations flocking to Jerusalem, flocking to God's people because of the joy and abundance and blessing that's there. God's people haven't been given a new heart, as is promised in Ezekiel 36. And so there's so much that's yet to come. And
Mm.
so I think only at this point have I realized just what a surprise Ezra and Nehemiah must have been. I
Mm.
think they probably thought when they came home, all the prophecies would be fulfilled at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we finished them, and I think if we've read the prophecies, if we've read the history of what the kingdom had been like, we think there is a future homecoming. There is a future return from exile. Actually, if the return from exile is a kind of a resurrection from the dead, there is a future resurrection needed to really do a work in the people's hearts. And
Mm.
all of that is in our minds as we come to the New Testament. Or rather, all of that is in our minds as we come to the last book in the Hebrew Bible, which is 1 Chronicles, which is going to beautifully go, let's just review for one moment. Let's start with
Mm.
Adam. Let's end with where we've got to here.
Mm.
And let's just review this history, but I think a history that is pointing forwards. Chronicles will be a very positive retelling of the history, not to whitewash the failures of the past, but just to say, okay, we've sort of got to an end point, but actually it's not an end. It's looking forward. Let's review that history before, well, actually a few hundred years, and then we'll see where it's heading with Jesus coming. So
Mm.
I think if we read Ezra and Nehemiah after the history, after the prophets, there's both a disappointment, but also I wonder, okay, these things haven't happened, and so there's hope around the corner. There's hope to come.
Mm.
Which brings us to Monday morning moments. Rachel, have you got something you want to take away from what we've been reading?
I think I feel I've enjoyed the big picture on this. So I'm enjoying some of these bigger themes, like just because something's being opposed when it's God's work doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing it. That also some opposition can lead to, we didn't, I think, cover it, but the king ending up funding the whole shenanigans, which is kind of an amazing turn up where people were trying to get this thing stopped,
Yeah.
and then they're like, oh, actually, here's the money. From when they'd gone and found this decree thing that had been written up, I think it turned up in like this guy's summer house. It wasn't where they were originally looking for it, and it's off somewhere else. So the fact that the Lord is graciously sovereign over that and was providing through the most bizarre means, that wasn't kind of a collection plate from the local church family. It was this secular king resting in God's sovereignty for that, and knowing that if you're doing something for the Lord, that's not necessarily going to correlate to its outward success. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So those kind of big picture themes, just that encouragement of Nehemiah's prayer, like he was in a position of power. And he could have been like, well, I'm here on my own wisdom and strength. I'm just going to ask for what I want. And he doesn't. He prays. And that humility and reminder of why would you not loop in the God of heaven in just our daily lives? Why are we not shooting up more arrow prayers? Well, me particularly. If I'm allowed one more thing to just keep us to my top priority is to remember that it's easy for 100 years to go by and us to just mean to get round to doing that thing that we wanted to for whether that's to do with church or our own discipleship or Bible or prayer or whatever it is. It's easy for it to be a tomorrow job and not to beat ourselves up that, not to try and earn ourselves salvation remotely, but just to enjoy that it is good to worship the Lord. So something in there. What about your good self?
Oh yeah, I want to piggyback on all of those. I like the 100 years thing. That's just such a helpful image, isn't it? I think for me, it's almost not a Monday morning moment in that I haven't quite read these books before with such a view on the future, and just realised that the future promises should determine so much in the present, and just reading out some of those promises that we know to be fulfilled in Jesus so clearly, but just letting what is both reality for us now in Christ, but also the full expression of those to come, let that impact the day to day, to live with God's promises sort of close to my heart and governing what I do. First, is just hugely encouraging because they're so wonderful and rich. It also just helps us navigate. Eternity is going to help us navigate our Monday morning, because that's history's going somewhere. It's not a random series of events. Nehemiah and Ezra is less about here's how to organize a building project. Here's how we'll learn some things about building projects and refurbishment projects and all the rest of it, but it's about God directing history to its appointed end, which is everyone gathered round Christ, and these wonderful promises come true. These wonderful promises for us as those included in Christ. So yeah, to let eternity and to let the glorious future impact my Monday morning and every morning. I think that's the thing I ought to be taking away.
Can I steal all yours back too? Which means we are into Chronicles for our next episode. I can honestly say I'm looking forward to this, and I can't always say that I've been super excited about Chronicles before, but I am now. So 1 Chronicles is up next, with our key chapters as 16 and 17 and 28 and 29.
Worth just saying, the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are genealogies, really showing the continuity of God's promises. So I think we can skim those. We don't need to sort of spend time in every line. There's a bit more in the notes, but don't let those chapters stop you getting involved in the rest of Chronicles. They're important to show that God's plans have continuity with the past, but after those chapters, we'll get to a much more gripping narrative, and that's where we'll be spending most of our time.
Cool. So those notes can be found at thebibleoverbrew.com, and we're able to do this because of the good folks at Good News Broadcasting Association. Thanks to them for making this recording possible. Until next time, thank you for listening. Thanks for getting involved. Take care. God bless. Goodbye.
Bye.